The Gulf of Tonkin. So the guy plugging his ears. Wait, somebody says to him, "Excuse me, Mr. President, the report was a mistake. There was no attack." And he says, "Don't bother me with the details, son. I've got a war to start." The Gulf of Tonkin. Was the fuse of the Vietnam War lit falsely? Revelations hint at shadows of deceit and high-stakes manipulation in the corridors of power. The staggering human toll haunts the legacy of a conflict wrapped in layers of murky intrigue and mystery. So we're talking about... There was a clear blue sky with just a few puffy clouds dotting the horizon the morning of August 2nd, 1964, when over 300 men on board the USS Maddox, a U.S. Navy destroyer on a patrol mission off the coast of Vietnam, awoke to alarms and shouts to man their battle stations. Although the United States wasn't at war, there was trouble brewing between communist North Vietnam and their southern neighbors, and the United States had amped up to its presence in the region. The Maddox had been in the area for a few weeks, running information-gathering missions in international waters without incident. So the men were surprised to be suddenly called to action. As they manned their posts, there came into view 3 small North Vietnamese torpedo boats. They were running with throttles wide open, closing the distance at breakneck speeds. The captain had only a moment to decide what to do. He knew the torpedo boats had a range of 1,000 feet and had to decide whether they were facing an attack before they got too much closer. The enemy boats showed no signs of slowing. The captain was sure they planned to strike. He instructed his crew to open fire, and mere seconds later, the Vietnamese captains fired as well. With quick thinking and quick maneuvering, the Maddox avoided a direct hit, and the torpedoes sailed harmlessly off into the open sea. The attackers weren't as lucky. The superior firepower and range of the U.S. destroyer made short work of the enemy boats. Several crew members were killed and more were wounded. All 3 torpedo boats were damaged beyond repair. The Maddox relayed the events to headquarters, and the Secretary of Defense was put on high alert. Another unprovoked attack on a U.S. ship could mean war. Surely the North Vietnamese understood the dangerous position they were in and would stay away from the U.S. fleet in the future. But far from being subdued by the sinking of their torpedo boats, the North Vietnamese seemed to be emboldened just 2 days after the Maddox was attacked. Under the cover of rough seas and low visibility, the torpedo boats were back. For 2 hours, the crew of the Maddox fired off rounds and zigzagged in evasive maneuvers, doing all they could to protect themselves and defend their ship against attackers. Billy, stop. Finally, the assault stopped. The Maddox had again emerged victorious. But as the captain and crew celebrated their escape, a heaviness settled in the air. When the president learned that the North Vietnamese had attacked again, things were going to get very serious. Things aren't always what they seem. Things did indeed get serious. Within hours of the second attack, President Lyndon B. Johnson interrupted national television to make an announcement, describing an attack by North Vietnamese ships on 2 U.S. Navy ships. Within 30 minutes of the second incident on August 4th, Johnson began demanding retaliatory attacks against North Vietnam. Soon after, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was drafted and passed by Congress, giving the president authorization to deploy ground combat troops in Vietnam. The Vietnam War raged on for almost 20 years and cost the lives of more than 58,000 U.S. troops. Additionally, over 1 million North Vietnamese soldiers were killed. 200,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, and more than 2 million civilians in the north and south. The U.S. military sprayed a chemical compound called Agent Orange all over the crops and jungles and in rivers and lakes to destroy the food supply and kill the vegetation that provided cover for the movements of the North Vietnamese army. Agent Orange turned out to be a deadly substance, leaving those who had come into contact with it with painful lifelong ailments and causing birth defects and cancers and eventual death. In addition to the fatalities of war, it is estimated that 1 million more soldiers, civilians, and children on both sides of the conflict suffered and died from exposure to this toxin. For all this suffering and death, many Americans still believe that the Vietnam War was a just cause, that it had to be fought to protect American interests and to keep the communist North Vietnamese from spreading their form of government forcefully on their southern neighbors. And besides, the North Vietnamese had brought this war on themselves when they attacked the Maddox. But as time passed, some people who had been there that day began to speak out about what they saw and what they didn't see in the Gulf of Tonkin. The truth would cost the Secretary of Defense his credibility and bring shame on the United States and the office of the president. There was no second attack on the Maddox. There weren't any Vietnamese ships in the area when the alleged attack happened. All the zigzagging and shooting that had been for nothing, an overreaction by the crew of the Maddox to bad weather, shoddy communications, tense nerves, and static that they misinterpreted as enemy chatter. At best, it was a mistake. The crew of the Maddox didn't have time to confirm what had happened before Johnson addressed the nation and declared North Vietnam the enemy. At worst, the president knew there was an uncertainty about what had taken place, but he and his advisors decided to use the story of the second attack to justify going to war. After all, Johnson had a lot of reasons to push for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. First, with an election just around the corner, Johnson saw an opportunity to appear tough on communism and shore up support from voters who were concerned about the spread of Soviet power around the world. Second, there was considerable pressure from the Defense Secretary Robert McNamara and other senior military officials to take a decisive action against North Vietnam after the initial attacks on the Maddox. There were even indications that Johnson's administration may have deliberately exaggerated or even fabricated aspects of the story in order to gain public support for military action. For example, documents released years later demonstrated that evidence had been falsified in order to support the proposal of retaliation. Some documents were altered and other items were cherry-picked to distort the truth and make the situation look like it was a set of repeated intentional attacks. There is also a record of crew members from the Maddox initially reporting that no enemy boats or aircrafts were in the region on August 4th, and that the faulty equipment and inexperienced crewmen led to false claims of ship sightings that day. Kill. Cui bono? One thing that becomes clear as we study history, and particularly the history of war, is that it is rarely the people of any nation who benefit from armed conflict. This is a strange truth, since it's almost always the well-being of the people that government leaders use in their justification of going to war. They make appeals to the people of their own country, asking them to spend large sums of money, allocate resources, often away from other things, and even commit the lives of their own young men and women to go somewhere far away and protect or liberate or defend others. The Vietnam War is an example of how military intervention often causes more harm than good, and how those who benefit are not the people who need the help most. U.S. military leaders and government officials conspired to go to war with North Korea because they believed communism must be contained at all costs, and allowing even one part of a nation to fall under communist rule would pose a threat to the safety and prosperity of the whole world. They were right about the need for containment. Were they right about the need for containment? Perhaps. Communism is a deadly ideology with a clear history of pain, suffering, despair, and death everywhere it's ever been tried. Protecting the world from communism is probably a noble goal, but how far should the United States have been willing to go to contain this lethal brand of government? By the time the war was over, the United States was fiercely divided. So many young Americans had been sent to die in a conflict that many back at home weren't convinced was a righteous or winnable cause. Americans had been heroes in the Second World War, fighting valiantly alongside their allies from France and other countries to free the world from the grip of a man bent on taking it over and cleansing it of anyone who he saw as inferior. The American people supported the war because they believed that what they were fighting and sacrificing for was good. Now they were unconvinced. And as the war in Vietnam dragged on, the people at home became more and more angry with their government. Protests were common and sometimes violent, and many soldiers were treated poorly when they came home. The war caused deep wounds in the hearts of the people of the United States and have taken many years to begin to heal. What about the people of Vietnam? Did they at least benefit from the war waged to save them from the communist neighbors in the north? It's true that they didn't fall under communist rule, but at what cost? It's estimated that millions of Vietnamese people died in and as a result of the war. Additionally, exposure to Agent Orange and other toxic chemicals sprayed on farmland, in the jungles, and along riverbanks is believed to have killed nearly 1 million people in the years following the war, and led to 500,000 birth defects and permanent disabilities. And side note, it's owned by Monsanto, who now sprays American farmland and soil with glyphosate. While there was a lot of confusion in the wake of the attack on the Maddox, it seems that some within the Johnson administration, particularly U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, were intentionally deceptive about what happened because they believed that retaliation and war was good for a good cause, to protect the world from communism. They thought it would justify inserting themselves in a conflict between nations halfway across the world. They could deal a deadly blow to an ideology they rightfully believed was a danger to freedom and democracy. But they were wrong, and in the end, their deceit led to decades of misery and suffering for not just the people they claimed to be saving, but for their own people as well. There were no winners in the Vietnam War. Why does this matter? Since the Vietnam War, the United States government has employed similarly dishonest methods to garner public support for war. For example, after the attacks on 9/11, even though there was no official tie to Iraq or Saddam Hussein, the United States invaded Iraq and ousted their president. Months of congressional testimony and near constant media attention convinced Congress and most Americans that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons that could inflict mass casualties on civilian populations and had to be stopped. The United States Army invaded Iraq on March 20th, 2003 in a mission they called Shock and Awe, which saw the might of the U.S. arsenal unleashed on a country roughly the size of California. The United States and allied forces spent the next 8 years setting up bases, chasing so-called terrorists, implementing a new government, and looking for weapons. No weapons were ever found, but at least 150,000, some estimates place this number at 600,000, Iraqis were killed and nearly 5,000 American soldiers lost their lives, and 32,000 Americans were wounded. In this example and countless others, there was no consequence for wrongfully invading another country, toppling its government, and causing mass casualties. In fact, military leaders were promoted, and weapons manufacturers, politicians, and government contractors made billions of dollars. Having learned how easy it is to deceive people into supporting war, and knowing how profitable war can be to those who stand to benefit from it, it's likely that these same methods of deception will continue to be used in the future. What we learned: the government will rely on faulty intelligence and even fabricated stories as the justification for starting a war. That's number one. Number two, those in positions of power don't always think through or don't care about the long-term consequences of the methods and means they use in war, causing lasting harm to natural resources and human life for generations after the conflict has ended. 3. Civilian casualties commonly outnumber military casualties. This means when wars are fought, average people who are just trying to live their lives and have no control over the actions of their government suffer the most harm. Families are torn apart, people are displaced, homes and cities are destroyed. Some populations never recover from war. There are usually no consequences for number 4. There are usually no consequences for government officials who lie to get their country into war or who cause harm to civilians through their actions. They pay no price for causing death, despair, and disability. So a declassified review of evidence by the National Security Administration historian, the Gulf of Tonkin Mystery, it's called, published in the NSA's classified journal in 2001. For the first time ever, what will be presented in the following narrative is the complete signals intelligence version of what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin between 2 and 4 August of 1964. Until now, the NSA has officially maintained that the second incident of August 4th occurred. This position was established in the initial, it's SIGINT, SIGINT report. I start that sentence over. This position was established in the initial SIGINT report of 4 August and sustained through a series of summary reports issued shortly after the crisis. Please stop. Sit still. In October 1964, a declassified chronology of events from 2 to 4 August in the Gulf of Tonkin was published by NSA, which furthered the contention that the second attack had occurred. In maintaining the official version of the attack, the NSA made use of surprisingly few published SIGINT reports. 15 in all. The research behind the new version, which follows, is based on the discovery of an enormous amount of never-before-used SIGINT material. This included 122 relevant SIGINT products, along with watch center notes, oral history interviews, and messages among the various SIGINT and military command centers involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incidences. Naturally, this flood of new information changed dramatically the story of the night of the 4th and 5th of August. The most important element is that it is now known what the North Vietnamese Navy was doing that night. And with this information, a nearly complete story finally can be told. Two startling findings emerged from the new research. First, it is not simply that there is a different story as to what happened. It is that no attack happened that night. Through a compound of analytic errors and unwillingness to consider contrary evidence, American SIGINT elements in the region and at NSA headquarters reported Hanoi's plans to attack the 2 ships of the DeSoto patrol. Further analytic errors and an obscuring of the information led to publications of more evidence. In truth, Hanoi's Navy had engaged in nothing that night but the salvage of 2 of the boats damaged on August 2nd. The second finding pertains to the handling of the SIGINT material related to the Gulf of Tonkin by individuals at NSA. Bill, beginning with the period of the crisis in early August into the days of the immediate aftermath and continued into October of 1964, SIGINT information was presented in such a manner as to preclude responsible decision makers in the Johnson administration from having the complete and objective narratives of events. I start over. The second finding pertains to the handling of the SIGINT material related to the Gulf of Tonkin by individuals at NSA, beginning with the period of the casualties in early August into the days of the immediate aftermath, and continuing into October of 1964. SIGINT information was presented in such a manner as to preclude responsible decision makers in the Johnson administration from having the complete and objective narrative of events of 4 August 64. Instead, only SIGINT that supported the claim that the communists had attacked the 2 destroyers was given to administrative officials. SIGINT, again, is signals intelligence. Okay. The exact how and why of this effort to provide only the SIGINT that supported the claim of an attack remain unknown. There are no smoking gun memoranda or notes buried in the files that outlined any plan or state a justification. Instead, the paper record speaks for itself on what happened. From this evidence, one can easily deduce that deliberate nature of these actions, and this observation makes sense for there was a purpose to them. This was an active effort to make SIGINT fit the claim of what happened during the evening of August 4th in the Gulf of Tonkin. Sorry about that. A dog. Bill. All right, good night, guys.